My name is Mike Murray, and I'm from Bemidji State University in Bemidji, Minnesota. And it is a lot warmer here than it is there. My wife said it was 30 below Celsius there the other day, so it's nicer here. Anyway, my talk today is entitled The Regional Job Guarantee. And I actually come from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where I graduated from. So I come from the kind of the school of thought I came from out of CFAPS, the Center for Full Employment Price Stability, which is the American variant of COFFEE here in Australia. So I had, my dissertation advisor was Matt Forstater. I actually had Stephanie Kelton for like 4 or 5 classes. So I'm very much come out of that school of thought. But Matt Forstater, as my advisor, I don't know if you've ever read a lot of his work, but he takes a classical political, he takes a classical political economy perspective of everything, really. So, I think we need to start thinking about the Green New Deal and the job guarantee and public sector employment within classical political economy perspective. And I wrote a bunch of notes on that last night because it's been kind of frustrating me. I think we really need to start from Marx as our origin rather than looking at even before we get to Keynes, right? But anyway, I think we need a new foundational background to look at the Green New Deal policies and the job guarantee and how that all fits in there in public sector employment more generally, and looking at the difference between the public sector, where the public sector should focus on what's valuable to society, right? And whereas the private sector, right, they're focused on they're making their own profits and pecuniary gain and things like that, right? And since these two entities come from different starting points, right? They have different objectives. The public sector is welfare maximizing. The private sector is profit maximizing. And you can see all this stuff in Marx, and because Marx's whole thing when he talks about the extraction of surplus value by the capitalist class, right? Well, that's essentially the private sector trying to, generate profits for themselves, right? They need to extract that surplus value, and then they need to, realize that surplus value through selling it for money, right? Where money becomes a realization of that surplus value. Anyway, no one's been talking about this stuff at this conference yet, and I think we need to start at a different foundation for analysis of the Green New Deal, and start from Marx, and then bring in Kalecki and Keynes after that, and then we need appropriate modeling, which is also in Marx and also Keynes, the Cambridge Keynesians, and honestly, I think we need to, right? Because how did we get to where we are? Well, we got to where we are because you had the neoliberal school start in whatever the 1970s, 1980s, but that came from all of a bunch of foundational theory from the 1950s, right? And right, so the Chicago School of Economists and so on and so forth, did all this stuff in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So when Thatcher and Reagan came on board in the 80s, they had this nice foundational theory to set up upon. Well, I think we really need to do that for the Green New Deal because we're in a transition, right? And we need to this third industrial revolution, as Jeffrey Rifkin, what's his last name? Jeremy, thank you. Jeremy Rifkin, right, as he calls it, right, is going to require a different foundational background. So anyway, it's just something I've been thinking about the last few days, and it has nothing to do with, well, that's somewhat what I was going to do. But I'll go pretty quick here now. I think, and I'll skip over a bunch of stuff since I already did that spiel. So I think Wendy Harcourt came to Kansas City in 2008, gave a fabulous keynote. Yes, and it's Dr. Harcourt's daughter, she does great work. And she says her view of sustainable human development is development that doesn't merely generate growth, but distributes its benefits equitably. It regenerates the environment rather than destroys it. It empowers people rather than marginalizing them. It enlarges their choices and opportunities and provides for people's participation in decisions affecting their lives. Sustainable human development is development that is pro-poor, pro-nature, pro-women. It stresses growth, but growth with employment, growth with environment, growth with empowerment, and growth with equity. So I think this is a good, the public sector needs to value these things, right? This is welfare enhancing. The private sector, by definition, is for their own pecuniary interests, right? The purpose of Apple is to make cool iPhones, right? And they come out with a new iPhone like every year because they want to make profits. But it's Apple's job to make profits for themselves and the shareholders, right? It's not Apple's job to take care of all this, and we shouldn't ask the private sector to take care of all this. We need to mandate that the public sector start valuing this stuff, and it causes us as a society to then redefine what should be public goods, right? Should education be a public good? Well, I would argue yes, it should be, right? Well, at the very minimum, is the right to survive, given a climate change crisis, a public good, right? Well, I believe it should be, right? We should all be, right? So like if we can agree on a set of facts, like this is our baseline, right? Everybody, regardless of their socioeconomic status, these are natural human rights, right? Education, housing, income, whatever, right? Come up with a given starting point that we can all agree on, and then we can debate about how we should get it done later on. So anyway, I'd like to look at the job guarantee, and this was only supposed to be about the job guarantee, but it kind of went off a little bit. Anyway, I'd like to look at it from economic democracy perspective. And here are the tenets for economic democracy: encouraging local governance and things like that. I can send Steve my slides, and he can send it to you guys. I want to give other people more time too. So the job guarantee basically says that, okay, and Pavlina Chernova has a great paper on the Levy Economics website on the job guarantee, and it says that we're going to have these community job banks. We're going to work with the nonprofit sector, and I would argue even work with the private sector, because right, if the goal, like Bill Mitchell said, is to transition back to the private sector for these job guarantee jobs, well then we need to ask the private sector, what skills do you need these people to have, right? So they're stakeholders too. I also would argue that we need to elevate the interests of marginalized groups, right? Because they need to be part of this discussion too, because they're very important stakeholders. And who is left out of that process? It is the marginalized groups every time, right? Every time. I read in the newspaper a couple of days ago, my local newspaper in Bemidji, there was a discussion at our local the local city hall on whether or not to bring in refugees, a handful of refugees into our city. We have a small city, 15,000. Do you know who is not at the table? The refugees, right? Like, right? And who's not at the table, right? Who's not in this room? The unemployed, right? We have a bunch of people, probably with jobs, right, talking about how to, right, help people that are worse off from us. The other day, when I forgot who it was, but they asked, who doesn't have a mortgage, sit down, right? And then most of you guys actually were still standing up, right? So like we have to understand that we are the privileged class, right? And we need to we just like white privilege, right? We need to recognize class privilege, right? And then right. So and then and after we recognize class privilege, we have to say, okay, what can we do to elevate these marginalized groups so they're part of the discussion? And I'm going to go to the. Oh, by the way, very quick, and I'll be 2 more minutes. Modern money theory, I'm not going to talk about it because we've talked about it for the last 3 days, but I think it's very interesting, and this is in David Harvey's book, Marx and the Madness of Economic Reason. Fantastic book. Everybody should buy it. It's awesome. Anyway, he says over 2007, 2008, after the financial crisis, the U.S. literally printed $16 trillion to bail out the financial sector. In 2007, China had I guess you'd use kilometers of high-speed rail. 0. And then what is this, at the same time, I forgot how many miles, but they also absorbed 17 million people into that process to build infrastructure, right? 17 million people. Right? So China took the financial crisis and decided to employ people and build infrastructure, right? The U.S., what they did with their money was they just bailed out the rich people, right? And now look at China. Look, that's the high-speed rail. That's the high-speed rail network. In the last 10 years, I just came from Shanghai, and I'm going back at 7:30 today. It is amazing what they're doing over there, right? It is the model that the Chinese are doing is literally amazing, right? And also, Shanghai is the cleanest city, the cleanest big city I've ever been in, ever. They have workers that will sweep the streets, and Shanghai is clean by 9 a.m. It is amazing. So anyway, we need economic democracy. We need participation and ownership. And we need to define who the stakeholders are, right? That's a very important part of the process. And then we need to engage in citizen participation that will then redistribute power away from those groups that already have all the power to the marginalized groups. And there's stuff on that. So anyway, this is all. For those of you who are interested, I could send anyone the slides and also the paper. Now, this is coming out in a book called The Algar Companion to Modern Money Theory, and it should be out, I don't know, sometime this year. All right, anyway, that's all I got. It's called the Algar Companion to Algar, E-L-G-A-R. Yeah, Algar. It's called Marx and the Madness of Economic Reason, and it was published in 2018, 17, something like that.
They ran out of the fancy lapel mics, so have to do this manually. Thank you, Ali. I put together a presentation for this. Obviously, one of the great things about coming to a conference like this is that there's a lot of overlap in the ideas that people are talking about, and my presentation is no different to that. So I'm going to skip through the first couple of sections quite quickly, but obviously if people do have questions about any of the thoughts, happy to talk about it. My name's Ed. I am the Economic and Climate Justice Director at GetUp, and we've been doing a lot of work after the election. Yeah, thank you. Chuck your hand up if you are a GetUp member. Hey, look at that. And it's been great to be here this week. And at the moment, I'm also sort of working on coordinating GetUp's bushfire response, which has been really hard, and a lot of our members are personally affected by bushfires. I mean, I think all of us have been affected by the fires, either personally or someone that we know, or caught in the smoke and haze in big cities. And it's sort of against that backdrop that I think conversations like this and meetings like this are incredibly important. Not just because they provide a sense of a path forward, but also because they're a really important coming together moment for those of us who are really worried about the future, for ourselves, our kids, our grandkids, and the environment and wildlife that have had tremendous consequences over the last couple of months. So I want to talk a little bit about where we are and where we're going, not just in terms of GetUp, but also I think thinking about some of the practical ways in which, the organising and... Can you make that full screen again? Organising and kind of climate efforts across the country are sort of starting to pivot out of the election and into what's next. And I think that the broad consensus is that we're a bit fucked right now, that we are in a really bad shape in terms of meeting our international global emissions reductions targets in a way that would keep us under 1.5% warming. And that it's not just climate change that's the problem. It's as people have talked about at this conference, a whole host of interconnected challenges that have capitalism and colonialism and extractionism at the sort of core of that problem. And for some people, it's already too late. Like we're seeing the consequences of climate change in our day-to-day lives play out. Much in the same way that we're already seeing the consequences of poverty and a welfare system that's woefully inadequate play out for working class people and unemployed people across the country. And it's pretty clear that the market isn't going to solve this problem. We don't need to engage in particularly complex economic theory to know that. You just have to look at a graph and see that it's not going to move on its own. And if we are going to kind of solve this problem, we need to do it together. And that this is a time for being strategic, because I am really worried about the way that Conservatives might respond to the climate emergency that we're in, not to fix the problem, but to weaponise that problem against marginalised and oppressed communities in the ways that they've done historically. And that means that solidarity, community, and a clear strategy for coming together and organising together is really, really important. And I think that one of the final things about the context that we're in is that if we were winning, I think that we would know about it. I think regularly about the fact that when Kevin Rudd proposed a tax that the mining lobby didn't like, they announced that they were spending $100 million to get rid of him. And they succeeded. And we haven't seen that kind of coordinated large-scale action happening from our opponents just yet. And I think that there's still a good way to go in terms of the fight that we need to have. One of the things that makes this situation even slightly more grim, and I swear it's going to get hopeful in a second, is that our political system is in some ways fragile right now and not necessarily equipped to deal with the crisis that we have. There are a couple of strategic weaknesses: a reactionary media cycle, a short-term electoral cycles, a compulsory voting system that tends to drive parties towards the centre in the way that they kind of campaign and develop political platforms, and that a lot of the time the internal democracy within our parties or institutional democratic structures aren't all that democratic, in a way that makes it very hard for someone like an AOC to come through and blow that system wide open. I think that Conservatives are taking advantage of that. They're running really effective scare campaigns. They have very little in the way of an attachment to the truth. And that those things, unfortunately, in the age of digital media and collapsing trust in journalistic institutions, are working. During the election, we saw that the death tax, became one of the most prominently searched things in the final days of the election because of a coordinated, centralised misinformation campaign. Also, we've got billionaires flooding the system with money, and we should probably do something about that. And that's a real problem for progressives, because I think that, a lot of what we've been talking about at this conference is how do we create a vision for a state that's bolder and more progressive in the way that it solves the problems. But in reality, what we're seeing is that people are losing faith in that system because of the forces that are pulling it further and further away from local grassroots organising and perspectives. And let's be frank, we might have some blame on the left in the way that we think about that as well. And I don't say that to be confrontational. I just say that because I think that it's really important that when we think about the politics that we're in right now, what we need to understand is that there is a real sense in which if you want to genuinely reach out to the communities that we need to re-engage in politics, we probably need to have a very careful think about the way that we do that. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But here's the first glimmer of hope. Climate voters are here. We saw that, and we've done a lot of research post-election about how people voted and why people voted. And more people voted on climate in the most recent election than any prior election. Climate was the #1 ranked issue for swing voters that changed their vote from Liberal to Labor. And it's the #1 concern amongst the Labor Party voters and members themselves. And so this issue is not going away in our politics. It's going to get better and better and better. And the constituency for climate action and progressive change is going to get bigger and bigger as well. And we need to be able to harness that moment. We need to be ready for that moment where that constituency doesn't just become a big swing, but it becomes a decisive swing. And we need to understand what that swing is for and have a clear vision that we can articulate for what climate action means to us as a community. And that's what I want to talk about now, which is I think that we need to figure out a way of building a path forward together. I think that there are a lot of conversations happening around the country right now about what a Green New Deal might look like, or what the right kind of solution to the electoral result that we just had was. One of the things that I think is really important for us to understand is that this room is not representative of the nation in which we live. And I mean, you can tell that just by looking around. Or the exercise yesterday where I think it was like 90% of you own your homes. Bastards. I think that in that context, what we need is to create mechanisms and forums and frameworks, not to just put forward a policy agenda that we require people to sign on to or sign off against, but to include them in the process of writing that policy agenda and co-creating that policy agenda. Because the Green New Deal is not just a set of policies. The Green New Deal is and should be a process of engaging with one another across more diverse constituencies than we have before. It's about co-creating a story of how we got to where we are in the crisis that we face, and co-creating a compelling vision that people can see themselves in, regardless of whether they're a coal worker in the Hunter Valley or someone in Warringah who thinks that climate action is more important than a budget surplus. And I think that what that process is going to need to do is meaningfully engage with the affected communities themselves. And in particular, what I think that means is having a chat to the unions, having a chat to frontline Indigenous communities, by that I mean all of them, activists and traditional owners, people whose land this belongs to still, but also having a think about all the diverse industries that need to be a part of creating that process. We also obviously need research, and we need a kind of strategic framework that ties the movement together. And I think that there are a couple of different ways of doing that are being discussed. There's already a lot of a process that's sort of bringing together some of the biggest unions in the country with the biggest climate organisations in the country and some of the biggest universities in the country to co-create a process for how we do this. One suggestion that we're working on throughout the course of 2020 and GetUp's playing a role in helping facilitate is a process called transformational scenario planning, which is a wanky kind of phrase, but it was used in post-apartheid South Africa to bring together incredibly conflicting groups, people who did not agree with each other at all about what the future of that country should or could look like, to co-create possible futures or an understanding of possible futures, not as a proposal for where we head or as a forecast of what will happen, but as an understanding that there are different ways that this could end up. And that if we work together in certain ways, we might end up in one place, and if we work together in others or fail to work together at all, we might end up in other places. And by building a container of trust in which those conversations can take place with a broad number of people, you begin to develop understandings of what might be unacceptable to all of us in a way that propels us towards the future that we might share together. And so I think that, one of the things that I feel pretty strongly about the Green New Deal and Green New Deal politics is that rather than coming with a set of proposals or policies, the thing that we need to do is agree on the process first. We need to have a process in place for First Nations consultation, and that will take time. I mean, there are so many different Indigenous nations around the country, and we should be including as many of them as possible. That could take a year. You know, we need to be doing the consultation work across the movement to build the vehicle for change. We need to be having a chat, not just to this room, but to rooms like this all across the country, in order to bring as many people into the conversation around what policy might look like and what policies matter most to people. And we need to build campaigns that speak to people on local, grassroots, individual levels in the communities in which they live and tie that big vision to the challenges that they're facing in their day-to-day lives. And there's already a lot of organisations out there doing this amazing work, so we need to tie those people together as well, rather than sort of come in over the top as GetUp or as anyone else to sort of make that happen. So I'm pretty hopeful that one of the things that's happened post-election is that people are thinking about ways of doing things differently. And in the same way that in the aftermath of 2016, when Trump got elected, I was so despairing that I quit my job and started, working at GetUp and was sort of like, the arc of the moral universe does not seem to be bending towards justice right now. But what we've seen happen in that country is a massive acceleration on the left towards genuine progressive organising, campaigning and movement building that in some ways we might just yet, the 2016 election might just have been the best thing to happen to us. That's my hope.
So, I'm Jane Flanagan. I'm not an economist. I'm a occupational therapist, and really probably can be counted among the many insufferable MMT enthusiasts in the room. So I really have come to this journey through, in actual fact, I am related to Bill Mitchell's wife. I'm her first cousin, so I don't know how I would have come to MMT if I hadn't have had Bill as a family member, because I think, I probably wouldn't have come across it until maybe the Future to Fight For campaign, because I was, a GetUp member, and still am a GetUp member, and it's an excellent campaign. So, I have been lucky in that way, and ever since really it has changed the path on which I've taken professionally, personally. And having been an occupational therapist in aged care, I have seen ever since I've worked in the system, it's been under-resourced and understaffed, and caseloads that have been unmanageable, and essential resources not available. They've been scarce. As an occupational therapist, we prescribe things like pressure care, which are, life or death really in a lot of circumstances. And these have been scarce. You're waiting weeks sometimes to get these pieces of equipment out to people. I had a client who, when I was working at MS Australia, who was told he needed to wait 3 years to be assessed to get a wheelchair, who was going through an acute episode of his MS and couldn't walk. And this was in a major city in Australia, in Sydney. Happened to be in one of the more impoverished areas of Sydney, which is Parramatta, the Parramatta local government area. So a lot of our time as clinicians really are about, fighting for the resources that should be available. And because our patients don't have those advocacy, they just don't have those advocacy skills. So I have experienced firsthand really the, terrible situation in which our health system is in. And I am sick of constantly hearing politicians talking about the burden of our ageing population, and we've only just heard Josh Frydenberg talking about the economic time bomb that is the aged. And, it just is shameful and appalling that we talk in these terms, because our aging population are a triumph, and we should be, supporting them as well as we can. And, as you would have heard maybe, Phil Lorne has done an excellent video on debunking the aging myths, and it's one of my absolutely favourite MMT videos, and how he explains, which we've heard over the last few days, the government can't run out of money. We can afford to pay for nice things like aged care and education and infrastructure and housing, all of these things that are fundamental to our health. And so, I think I've since shifted from a clinical focus. I'm still working as an occupational therapist, but I now am doing a Masters of Public Health, and with a view to I think I told Stephen Howe about a year ago, I'm determined to shift the conversation within the public health community. So I'm now part of the Political Economy of Health Special Interest Group on their committee, and slowly chipping away at what is still, they're still dictated by the orthodoxy, so they're still talking about, getting money off the rich people before we can afford the things that we need in healthcare. But I think more so now, I think my focus has shifted, because it's now thinking about, health in all policies. Our health isn't just determined by our access to a hospital or access to community services. It's determined by whether or not we have access to good education, good transport and housing. All of these factors influence your health across the lifespan, and if you start off in poverty, you're likely to have a shorter lifespan. So it's extremely important, and it is a life and death matter, and health is impacted by what happens on a macro level, our everyday health, our everyday well-being. My focus now is really about broadening the conversation and promoting modern monetary theory as a basis of improving our democracy and improving equality, and ensuring that everyone has equal access, equal rights to health, improving health equity in Australia. And I really, it is against my grain. I'm shaking in my boots right now, and it's not something that I would usually do, but I really, if I can do it, we all can do it. And I think we just have to be bold, and we have to be vigilant, because our healthcare system is being privatised by stealth. Our aged care reform system now is now a market model. Our NDIS it's a market model, and it's completely unfair and inequitable. And the workers within that system are also facing, a lot of hardship, because it's become casualised. So I'm now part of a gig economy in the health sector. So I now am looking at, I'm part of Modern Money Australia, which I have co-founded with several members. And I think once we've finished discussing here, I'm just going to call them down, and I hope it's okay, but we're just going to give you a brief rundown of what we're doing, and maybe if you would like to join in, we're going to try to establish groups across Australia. And I just think, as Bill said, it's an educative approach. I suppose we need to really be able to empower ourselves with that knowledge, to then be able to empower everyone else and to then be able to challenge the lies that our politicians tell us, because we know we can have nice things. We've got a huge, it's a huge challenge ahead of us, and I'm frightened. And but MMT, I think is hopeful. It is what gives me hope anyway, but I know that it's a big challenge to try and shift the conversation. Anyway, so I'll leave it at that, and
Okay. Can everyone? Yeah, fantastic. So my name's Lachlan McCall. I'm an economist and a public sector union activist. I'll be talking in a moment at the in the trades union panel. And I'll try not to repeat too many points, but I wanted to sort of echo the comments that have been made by my three co-panelists. In particular, I think I really want to emphasise. I really sort of want to emphasise what Ed was saying about the importance of how we have these conversations out there in the community. I'm conscious that, and I want to emphasise something, another point that Ed made. This is, and we'll return to this point in the unions panel as well. This is a very white collar audience. I'm about as white collar as they get. I don't know. The phrase Chardonnay used to be, the Chardonnay socialist label may as well have just been invented for me. I'm essentially, I'm about as far away from the blue collar working class as you can get, and yet one of the things that I've learned over a number of years is that we primarily as upper middle class white collar activists, as people in particular in the tertiary sectors of the economy, we have not been particularly good at going out and listening to the communities who are on the front line of the climate crisis. And the people... and Bill sort of alluded to this in his talk yesterday. If anyone has come across the MMT podcast, which is fantastic, by the way, there's an episode which is just a recording of Bill's speech at the UK Labour Conference a couple of months ago. And it's absolutely fantastic. And Michael alluded to the issue of class privilege. And I think that is a critical issue, because we cannot go into blue-collar communities that have been, as I'll say in the unions panel in a second, they've essentially been gaslighted or gaslit by neoliberalism. I mean, neoliberalism is a form of economic gaslighting. We deliberately create a pool of unemployed workers to suppress wages and inflation. We then but neoliberalism then blames workers for what has been done to them. And all too often then, as environmental activists, we then go into these communities and have the disgraceful gall to belittle and denigrate and deride people for having the sheer audacity to seek to escape the poverty and misery of unemployment. And then we wonder why they voted against us. I mean, look, I'm personally am on board with the aims of say, Stop Adani, and I don't want to offend anyone here in what I'm about to say, and I'm not saying it, again, to be confrontational. I do wish the message had been start the Green New Deal rather than Stop Adani. And I say that as someone who doesn't want the Adani coal mine built. But I would have much preferred it if we had had a convoy going into regional Queensland, into Rockhampton, saying, listen, what's been done to you is an atrocity. The fact we know, if there was a paper that came out in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry from 2015 that said unemployed men are 4.6 times more likely to take their own lives than employed men. What's been done to working people in Australia in the neoliberal era is criminal. And to then the vital, to get to the core of the political economy of the Green New Deal, we have a twin crisis here, the climate crisis and the employment crisis. And both are killing workers. Both of them are killing workers. And to construct any environmental narrative or environmental agenda that lectures at workers rather than listening to workers and letting them drive and lead their own, essentially, at the risk of being a bit wanky, but to lead their own emancipation from this crisis. The idea that, and we saw a lot of it after the election. We heard people talking about Quexit. Fuck that, sorry. The narrative that blue-collar workers in regional Queensland don't know what's good for them, and they have to be told what's good for them by us. That is, Michael used the term class privilege earlier, and if we're going to have any success whatsoever in saving ourselves from an existential threat, then that has to be the starting point, is starting by essentially being aware of and questioning our own assumptions in class privilege. The working class knows what's in their interests. They weren't, seduced by Murdoch or the belittling narrative that suggests that somehow blue-collar workers somehow don't know what's in their own best interests, as opposed to an honest reflection that would say perhaps the way we approached that, or perhaps sometimes the way we've approached these things hasn't been particularly inclusive. Or perhaps, as Bill Mitchell says in his talk to the UK Labor Party, and he mentioned, he alluded to it yesterday, what are the optics of upper middle class, white collar, cosmopolitan people like myself? I mean, as I said, I alluded to earlier, the entire Chardonnay industry in this country is propped up by me. But the idea of going into regional communities and essentially saying, look, we're just going to stop this. We're going to stop production of this, and then we go home. What do these communities who have been destroyed by neoliberalism and high regional unemployment, what are they going to do? How else are they going to react? And the thing that I think is quite inspiring about the Green New Deal, whether you call it a green transition, some people want to suggest the phrase the Green Accord, all sorts of language, whatever. I don't know what exactly the correct terminology is. But a strategy, call it green industry policy, if you will. Actually, the Andrews government in Victoria, I think, might have is close to, I think, nailing the correct kind of framing for this. Most of the Victorian government's climate policy is done under the guise of industry policy, because the environmental vote's already there. They're already being spoken to, but it's people in the outer western suburbs of Melbourne who need to have the link between their interests and climate change action drawn. So what does the Andrews government do? They trumpet the fact that they are opening an old, formerly shuttered Ford factory in Geelong. They're reopening it as a factory for wind turbines. And that's blue-collar industry policy. But it's actually climate policy. It's climate policy under the guise of industry policy. And as a result, a whole section of the population that have been persuaded by elements of the Murdoch press and others to view climate change as the concern for people who are rich enough to afford to be concerned by it. Which, of course, I do think the events of this summer are beginning to shatter that narrative. As the crisis, the tragedy that's happening in our country, I think is beginning to break that narrative. But it is still a very deeply entrenched one, that environmentalism and climate action are things for people who can afford to worry about them. And smashing that narrative is absolutely crucial. We are not going to be able to save ourselves and save the planet if we can't do that. And so that does involve, for instance, valuing manufacturing and respecting manufacturing workers. It involves engaging with blue-collar workers. As we'll say in the unions panel, it's not just a political necessity, it's an economic and industrial necessity. We're not going to decarbonise without building a lot of batteries, solar panels and wind turbines. Who's going to dig up the iron ore to build the wind turbines? Who is going to make the steel? Who is going to create the hydrogen-fired steel-making industry to replace a metallurgical coal-fired steel industry? Who's going to dig up the rare earths and minerals we need to make the batteries? Who's going to then manufacture the batteries? And it's not going to be my class. I don't know how to do that. I don't have the skills to do that. I did political economy. I would just stand there next to a pile of raw materials and just talk about Sraffa and Marx at it. Like, And who are the people who've got the skills and the abilities to actually put this thing together? It's the people who for far too long have been spoken at, lectured at, denigrated for taking jobs in extractive industries just because that is what neoliberalism has forced them to do. Because neoliberalism has deliberately ensured that there are fewer jobs than there are workers who need them. Because that's our, as Bill brilliantly says, that's been essentially our counter-inflationary policy, is deliberate poverty and unemployment, which is overwhelmingly concentrated in the outer suburbs and the regions. It's overwhelmingly concentrated among people with less educational privilege. It's overwhelmingly concentrated among the working class. And so, whatever you stand on the job guarantee, I happen to think the job guarantee is one of the most brilliant, elegant, really beautiful sort of bits of public policy design and thinking I've come across. I think it's just genius. Whatever your stance on it, the political economy of full employment as the main charge against climate change has got to be vital. Because these are policies, these are ideas that first and foremost are going to create jobs in the outer suburbs, first and foremost create blue-collar jobs in the regions. And if we can't get that one right, if we can't lead the charge against regional and rural unemployment and say this is literally how we stop the climate crisis, if we can't marry those two together, when I would say it would be a fairly sort of intuitive thing. If we can't get that right, we're going to simply fail. So. So I'll just quickly finish by saying our personal responsibility, I think, as environmental activists is when we see conservative voters, not conservative politicians, but conservative voters and voters, swing voters, particularly in the kinds of places that swung against the Greens and against Labor last May. And we see people sort of saying things online that we don't agree with, that are conservative, or da-da-da-da. We've got to learn to be empathetic and we've got to learn to listen. And we can't just lecture them. We've got to hear where they're coming from, we've got to learn where they're coming from. If a deeply conservative voter ends up backing climate action because they want a job in renewable energy, not because they agree with any of the other stuff, not because that's good enough. That's good enough. So I just encourage everyone, I think, as an environmental movement, learning to listen to communities who traditionally have not been part of the environmental movement, who often don't necessarily share the same values as us. It's an electoral and political necessity, and we've got to get better at doing it. But thank you all for coming. It is amazing that we've actually managed to turn out to this conference that we have, and it's a real sign of the urgency around these issues that's emerging in our society, in our country. Thanks.
Yeah, what time do we?
I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions.
Do we?
Yeah, first.
Do you want to point out who?
One is coming.
Why don't you stand up if you...
One of the ladies in the...
Hi, yeah, thanks very much for the discussion. I really enjoyed it. My name's Dan Bleakley. I'm a member of Extinction Rebellion, and I recently did a 10-day hunger strike on the steps of Victorian Parliament to fight
Good on you.
for the Victorian government to declare a climate emergency, and also, yeah, exactly. I also glued myself to the window of Siemens' office and was arrested about a month ago as well, which has helped forward that campaign. But I wanted to just talk about, well, I had a point first and then I had a question. Extinction Rebellion has an incredible global network now, and I think a lot of the ideas that have come up over the last few days need to be shared around the world, and I think XR Network would be a great way to share those, because ideas, good ideas, move very quickly within our network. And the other point, well, the question is, well, our third demand is that governments use citizens' assemblies to make decisions, or sortition, and that's been raised a few times over the last few days as well, because we believe politics is broken and the system is completely broken, and politics can't solve these problems. So I just wanted to hear what the panel thought about sortition and citizens' assemblies.
Sure. Well done. I mean, it's awesome that there are so many diverse types of activism coming together, and people, it's incredible to see so many people putting their body on the line for the environment. So personal kudos to you. I think citizens' assemblies are a great idea, and one of the things that we're doing in the immediate aftermath of these bushfires is supporting the emergency services for climate action, who have been calling for a summit of bushfire-affected communities and people on the ground to kind of get their demands and make sure that they're heard within parliamentary structures as well. I think that it's really important that we create new forums and places for people to have that say. And I also think that, as you said, XR is one of those global movements now that has that reach, and awesome if these ideas spread through that network as well. Is my opinion. There's a question up here in the middle.
Oh, hello.
Yep.
So my name's Emily. I am working for a business or organisation that's looking to instigate change to the circular economy. So that's something that I think is quite interesting that hasn't come up in discussion over the past 3 days, which I'm quite disappointed about, especially how it relates to the ecological economy. But that's not really what I want to say. I wanted to touch on the private versus public sector that you're talking about, also gaslighting and just the success of neoliberalism on a personal level for activists as well as on a public level. So kind of, Ed, what you're talking about with bushfire response, what is our role as activists who are heartbroken and want to donate, but then so many of these donation appeals are going to the RFS? So this is a failure of government, and why are we then feeling like we should donate to a failure of government? And then more broadly on that, the failure of government and failure of democracy, what is the role of private industry who in some ways are taking leadership on this question in a way that governments aren't? And if we can't elect governments that will take action on this, what's the role of private industry? But I don't want to go to them as the answer, because obviously they're not. But if our public institutions aren't doing enough, how do we support private industry to do that? And what's their role in tackling this crisis when, in order to get public action, we have to be able to elect a government who's willing to expand the public sector, which seems impossible globally at the moment?
Okay. Well, First off, I don't know anything about Australian politics, but so I would try to answer your question a little more generally. And again, I am an academic, so sorry if this sounds a little academic. So there's this idea of the public sphere and the private sphere, right? And if we accept that the public sphere is geared towards the interest of maximizing total welfare, and the private sphere is towards the interest of making money for themselves, right? First off, we need to accept that dichotomy, right? And then if the public sector is not going to engage in maximizing your welfare, right, because they do whatever sort of policies that do not benefit you, then can we look to the private sector? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? So there's this economist, Adolf Lowe, who probably nobody, even economists don't, shout out, one person, 2, 3. So Adolf Lowe talks about what is termed spontaneous conformity, and it's this idea that if the private sector has objectives that works towards their own goals of making money, but also somehow facilitates the goals of maximizing welfare, then that is something you can support. So I always give the example in my class of Toyota and the Prius, right? So, but why did Toyota create the Prius? They created the Prius so they can make money. I mean, that's why they did it. And however, and then you had innovations there too, but that also does support this macro goal of enhancing social welfare, right? So yes, there are times where we can support private industry because their outcomes will also align with our goals. But we have to remember that their foundational objective is different from yours, right? You're seeking to maximize total welfare. They're seeking to maximize profits, right? So we have to separate out the outcomes from from their goal because, maybe over time they'll have different outcomes that don't match your goal, right? So that's where those two can align and also diverge. And again, Adolf Lowe on spontaneous conformity is a nice example of that, and his view of instrumentalism as well. If anyone wants more references on that, it's good.
Sure, there's another question just there.
That's convenient because mine was about the private-public dichotomy as well. I was interested when you say private sector. I think you're conflating that with capitalism. Because if you have a worker co-op, which is a democratic economic system, that is also the private sector. That's not the government sector, is it? I think can we be specific? Because I want to take that thing back. I want to take the private sector back away from capitalism because people talk about it's either capitalism or it's government control.
Sure.
And there isn't that. There is a third option, which is
Yeah, sure.
private collective ownership.
Post-state socialism.
Yes, sure, I accept that.
Which is
Yes, I agree.
And maybe there's one more question, but it's all the way up the back left there. Oh, there's a woman here as well. Yes, yep. Happy.
In the middle there, she was in the middle there. Yes, you ma'am.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name's Fiona, and I'll do my best to be succinct. But as a preamble, I want to let you know that I migrated here in 1987, traditional Labour voter. I'm now in my 60s. I have 3 adult children, 1 in the army. I have 2 grandchildren. I live in public housing in a continual state of fear of losing my home because it's in Kent Town. I have a Master of Arts degree and I have a Doctor of Philosophy degree from this university. I didn't buy them. For the best part of 10 years, I was a casual academic. Go figure how you can be a casual academic for 10 years. Until about 2 years ago when I became unemployed. So I don't even hear myself being talked to. I don't exist discursively. I only ever hear myself being talked about. I have dear friends who live on, Kangaroo Island. At the start on Friday, Kangaroo Island was referenced as the jewel in the ecological crown of this nation state. And the destruction is devastating, not just to buildings, for goodness sake, but to non-human life form. And I would suggest to you also that very many of us are traumatised. Very many. We have a country in a state of PTSD. Anybody who's been following this. I staggered out of the house after watching my friend's neighbourhood, basically, ablaze, to the bottle shop, as you do. And I go to the bottle shop in 42 degrees and I say to one of the blokes, and I use the word advisedly, 40-odd-year-old bloke who's studying law part-time here, he says, "Are you having a good day?" And I said, "Are you being facetious?" I said, "We've got half of Kangaroo Island on fire. We've got Trump about to start World War III. We've got some maniac in Brazil setting fire to rainforests, and you're asking me if I had a good day?" Anyway, it was pretty quiet because it was so hot. Another young guy pipes up and he says, "What we need is a revolution." I'm like, "Yeah, I agree. But how? How?" Now this is my point of my response to the person. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but you said, and I agree with you, what is going on is criminal. It is nothing less than criminal. And another guy pipes up and he says to me, "Well, maybe not a revolution, but what we can do," and this is what I want your responses to. He says, "What we can do," he says, "we organise a citizen's arrest." Yeah, we organise a citizen's arrest. And I say, "Who do we arrest?" I said, "The whole fucking lot of them." He says, "We start with Scott Morrison." and we arrest him. We arrest him for manslaughter. We arrest him for breach of duty of care as our highest paid public servant responsible to represent us, and we arrest him if it's got through yet, and I don't know if it has in international law, the crime of ecocide. And I'd like your response.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing your story and for being here. I guess it is really difficult to talk about that stuff, and we do a lot of work with the Unemployed Workers Union and Alex, who sort of spoke yesterday, and I know that it is particularly hard for unemployed people during the bushfires and moments of crisis like this when you are so criminally ignored by the government. So thank you, and thanks for your courage in standing up and telling your story. I mean, sure. My concern is, and I mean, I don't want to be the person who puts a dampener on it. My concern is that the government is really powerful in the sense that it probably wants to provoke a conflict with people that it knows that it can win. And I think that the conflict that we're seeing in places, and it's not just the Liberal Party. I mean, the ALP in Queensland is doing some stuff to crack down on our basic, essential democratic rights to protest in a way that I think is pretty shameful as well. I think that we are heading towards a polarization of people, and I think that as part of that, there are going to be many times and opportunities for us to take the kind of action that you're talking about. But I also think that one of the things that has struck me over the last couple of months as we've been watching the fires really closely is that the thing that always hits me here when I'm confronted by the limitations of our leaders is the limitlessness of our care and our altruism for each other, and the kinds of drastic political action that I'm most interested in right now are the acts of community that we can demonstrate to one another that show that we don't need them. I think that one of the things that is most powerful right now is the sense from communities around the country that are coming together. You know, you've got tradies going around and clearing gutters for free to help their neighbours prepare for bushfires. You've got petrol stations opening the Bowsers for people trying to flee. And it's the sense that we were here, where were you? And I think that sentiment is going to stink on Scott Morrison for the next 2 years until the election. It's not going away. You will ask in focus groups 2 years from now, how do you think Scott Morrison handles himself in a crisis? And people are going to go, he fucks off to Hawaii, right? And I think that in that context, the thing that I'm really eager to see and the thing that I really want us to do is to take that spirit of radical action, but turn it towards ourselves and our communities and forget about that bastard. But that's my opinion. I mean, I think that you have a valid point. I think other people have valid points as well.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your question. It was very the fact that you've been a casual lecturer for 10 years. It is appalling, and shout out to the NTEU who've been fighting against the casualisation of university staff. It's an indictment of how we as a society treat our educators across the board, that someone can be a casual for 10 years. That's appalling, and it is a scandal. It's absolutely, Jeff's right, it's a scandal. And also, what a tragedy that you have all this education, you have all this knowledge and expertise, and what an indictment on the way our society values work, that you are out of work and in precarious housing. So, of course, we need a job guarantee. Of course, we need to properly pay our educators in the primary, secondary and tertiary sectors. Obviously, we need to restore job security. I mean, the job guarantee doesn't just is really for what sort of one type of work, but across the board we have to re-engage with job security and full employment and properly value our tertiary sector in particular. On the latter part of your question, I am not really at liberty to respond because of, well, I'm a civil servant. I can speak about neoliberalism in general. I'm not really in a position to be able to speak publicly about partisan matters. But I do actually want to address the emotion. The emotion in your question. I mean, it is. The country is in PTSD. You are absolutely right. I mean, this is. It's interesting to me that the analogy about war mobilisation, both in terms of the Green New Deal, has come up from people across the board recently, because the country is at war. We are under siege. The bushfires. This is our version of the Blitz, essentially. And so I think thinking in those terms actually is quite useful, because it helps us to conceptualise the scale of people's grief, the scale of the damage that's been done to our ecosystem, to our homes, to our lives, and it also does help us to frame the way we respond, because as Stephanie was saying the other day about how to pay for the Green New Deal, how to pay for the war and that sort of thing, one thing that gives me hope is that, I mean, the Americans have got a challenge where outside World War II, generally speaking, they've always been essentially a private sector economy, whereas in this country we've had Medicare for decades. We are used to the idea in this country of mass public sector mobilisation, and I think that in that sense, the fact that people are starting to think of those terms is helpful. But I completely understand and empathise with how you're feeling at the moment, because I'm feeling the same way, and it is horrific. And I mean, we've got
to wrap up. But
sorry, yeah, I'll let you go.
Jane's got 30 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, I really empathise with you, because I'm also in a very precarious position employment-wise. So, and also I feel like I have been for quite a while, and that was because of various factors that my future also looks quite grim. So I'm I don't have much superannuation. I don't have a house that's my own. I rent. So my chances of having a secure future, I feel are quite limited. I also, citizen arrest, I'd love to be involved in that. That'd be amazing. But I think, I hope that we can do it. Yes. I hope we can move things quickly. I'm worried that Bill's right, that it's going to take a long time and we're going to burn. And, at the moment, I feel, we have a great sense of community in Australia, and everyone is generous. But when it comes to everyone facing scarcity and everyone facing the horror of the fires or the horror of no water, and we won't have our social cohesion, it will just break down, community will break down. And, while it exists now, I think we're all facing, a difficult future. So I really don't want to wait a generation before these changes come into, I want it to happen now. I just don't know how that's going to happen. So, yeah.